And welcome to the Ambassador Vita Italian Culture Institute for this annual commemoration of International Holocaust Remembrance Day, which will be introduced by the Ambassador, His Excellency Claudio Bisogniero.
Thank you very much, and welcome to the Italian Embassy tonight. We are here for a special occasion tonight, as we just said, to commemorate the Holocaust Remembrance Day. By the way, Italy was among the very first European nations to adopt a national law declaring designating January 27th as the Holocaust Remembrance Day. This commemoration is always very important to us in Italy, but particularly this year, which is 2013, the year of Italian culture in the United States. So this year we had more events linked to this commemoration here at the embassy and with our network of consulates in the United States. Last Thursday, as a matter of fact, we had here at the embassy a presentation of a play by Tonino Tosto, The Invention of the Enemy, which is of course dedicated to the issue we are commemorating tonight. But tonight we have truly a special event. We are showing the documentary film, The Writer's Enemy. I saw this movie for the first time 20 years ago, and I was deeply impressed by it. So when I had the opportunity to be responsible for organizing this year's events, this year's commemoration, I immediately indicated that was my choice for the movie to be shown tonight. I think this documentary film shows that even in the darkest moment, resilience can emerge and allow men to be truly human. It shows how a few Italian officials, diplomats, the military, were able to resist the regime's anti-Semitic orders through bureaucratic means, through practical delays. I think in a way you could say it was a virtuous implementation of the red tape, and it worked, because this prevented the deportation of 40,000 Jews from the then Italian occupied areas in France, in Greece, and in Yugoslavia. And I think it shows that a spark of light and humanity can actually occur even in an otherwise hopeless night. To tell us about this documentary movie and about the special book, we hear tonight the movie's director, Josef Rocklitz, who came here all the way from London. Because this film, this documentary movie, actually tells the story of his father, Imre Rocklitz, who survived the Holocaust. Now, Imre sadly passed away a few weeks ago, leaving behind a testimony of dignity and of civic courage. And I think it's a testimony that we acknowledge and celebrate today, so that tragic events, those tragic facts of the Holocaust, are never forgotten, particularly among the younger generation. So it is a great pleasure and gratitude that I give the floor to Mr. Rocklitz.
Good evening. Thank you, Ambassador Bisogniero and the Italian Cultural Institute for hosting this event and inviting me to present my film and my father's book on which the film is based. This evening marks International Holocaust Remembrance Day, but as the Ambassador mentioned, it's also a very personal day of commemoration for my father, who passed away last month, just a few weeks before his 88th birthday. It is his story that brings me here today. It all began in 1981, when I accompanied my father on a fact-finding visit to Yugoslavia. He had begun to write his wartime memoirs and felt he needed to retrace his steps between 1938 and 1945 in order to refresh his memory of events and places. My job was to take pictures to illustrate his future book. Marshal Tito had died a year earlier, but public devotion was still very intense, with portraits of the deceased president on display everywhere. My father and I first went to the city of Zagreb, to where he had escaped in 1938, aged only 13, fleeing Nazi Vienna. Then to the town of Derventa, where the Croatian fascists, the Ustaše, had interned his mother in 1941. Derventa was where my father had seen his mother for the last time. She was deported to Auschwitz a year later, aged 44. We went to the site of the death camp at Jasenovac, where my father was imprisoned in January 1942 at the age of 17. He was forced to work there as a gravedigger, taking part in digging mass graves for the hundreds of Serbs, Roma, Jews, and real or imagined political opponents being murdered there every day, or dying of cold, disease, and starvation. And then we drove down to the coast of the Adriatic Sea, to a sleepy little town called Kraljevica, built around an ancient castle. My father got out of the car and walked through the streets, trying to remember where he had been 40 years earlier. Finally, he just stopped the passerby and asked in his still fluent Serbo-Croatian, "Do you know where the Italian concentration camp was?" And the passerby just pointed further ahead at a dense, overgrown area of shrubs and trees. We approached and carefully penetrated the high grass and bushes. And what happened next was the decisive moment that led me to make The Righteous Enemy, the film you're about to see. From beneath the shrubbery, traces of cement outlines emerged, apparently the foundations of large barracks, and among them the remnants of smaller square structures with drainage holes that looked very much like showers. And strange concave cement formations rose out of the grass that looked as though they might have been rudimentary latrines. And bricks and building debris of all kinds lay strewn everywhere. This was where about 1,200 Jews had been interned in 1942 by fascist Italy. And the scene looked exactly like the pictures I was familiar with of the ruins of death camps elsewhere in Europe. And yet when I looked at my father, he was beaming. "This concentration camp," he said, "is where I was protected by the Italians." To me, the notion that what resembled the trappings of genocide could in fact be the tools of survival was mind-boggling. According to my father, those ruins were the exact opposite of what they appeared. I was so perplexed by what I saw that I felt compelled to make some kind of sense of it. And that is essentially why I made this film. As it turned out, I finished the film 6 years later, in 1987. But my father's memoirs, Accident of Fate, were published only in 2011, 30 years after our trip to Yugoslavia. I am comforted that for the last year and a half of his life, my father was able to enjoy the recognition and appreciation with which his book was received. This is what he has to say in chapter 9 about his arrival in that Italian camp in November 1942, at the height of the Holocaust. Our convoy turned into the village of Kraljevica, and the trucks drove through a gate in a tall barbed wire fence and stopped. It took us only a few moments to realize that we were now enclosed in what ominously resembled a concentration camp, complete with wooden barracks, watchtowers, armed guards, and searchlights. The Italian camp for civil internees in Kraljevica brought back sinister recent memories. There were 4 large barracks and 8 smaller ones clustered together in a sloping field, already turned into a muddy bog by the autumn rains, and powerful searchlights beamed down on us from the ramparts of the ancient castle that loomed over the camp. But the resemblance to Jasenovac ended there. It quickly became obvious that this was a concentration camp where the inmates were meant to survive. The camp guards were ordinary Italian soldiers, not members of the fascist militia, and their outlook on the world patently did not include hating Jews. Their hatred, if they harbored any, was directed against the war and the havoc it was wreaking on their lives. After a very brief period of caution, I came to take their civility for granted. All the Italian military personnel we encountered in Kraljevica treated us decently. They continually sought to improve our living conditions, providing us with medicine, blankets, kitchen utensils, and even pieces of military clothing. It was not uncommon for officers to take leisurely strolls through the camp, making the occasional remark about order to be kept or garbage to be removed. I noticed that their comments were often thinly veiled pretexts to strike up friendly conversations with us on a wide variety of topics. I understood that they were bored and lonely and simply looking for someone to talk to. In all of Axis-occupied Europe, we Jews were worthy only of death. Here in this godforsaken camp on the shores of the Adriatic, we were sought after conversation companions. As the months passed, I increasingly appreciated how safe a place the camp was to wait out the war. I even turned down an opportunity to escape. A corporal with whom I had become friendly suggested that I don an Italian uniform, which he would supply, and walk out the main gate while he was on guard duty. I was convinced that he was sincere and that this was no trap or provocation, but had to explain to him that I was not at all tempted to leave the camp. Where could I go? I had no desire to join the communist partisans or the royalist Chetniks, and I certainly did not want to risk being caught and sent back to the death camps. After all I had seen and experienced, I longed to stay where I was, sheltered from the Ustasche and the Nazis, and to wait until the war ended or until we were liberated by the Allies. But as we know, my father's experience is far from the whole story regarding Italy and the Jews. At the very same time as he and thousands of non-Italian Jewish refugees outside Italy were benefiting from a kind of best-case scenario, thousands of Italian Jews in Italy were suffering a worst-case scenario. Humiliated by the racial laws, stripped of their rights and of their livelihoods, thrown out of schools and universities, and subjected to harassment and abuse of all kinds. And later, many were arrested with Italian collaboration and deported to the death camps, like Primo Levi. And in Italian-occupied Yugoslavia itself, where my father was, the Slovenian population was being very harshly treated. Considered rebels for their resistance against the imposition of Italian rule, thousands, including women and children, were arrested and interned in concentration camps, where many died of starvation, disease, and maltreatment. And despite these and many other similar examples, some Italian politicians still today periodically engage in a trivialization of the crimes committed by the fascist regime in Europe and in Africa. Their conduct is unacceptable and dangerous, and it must be firmly denounced and countered. But the falsification of history by some must not provoke the distortion or concealment of history by others. And in this respect, I would like to conclude by quoting the very last words my father wrote about his beloved Italians. It was about a year ago. He was responding to an online review of Accident to Fate, of his memoirs, published on a well-known academic website for historians. The review was generally positive, quite detailed, and it discussed several of the book's main themes. But to my father's astonishment, the review only referred to 16 of the book's 20 chapters. The 4 chapters he had devoted to his positive experiences with the Italians were completely ignored. My father shot off a reply, which the website has published. These were his concluding words. I am aware that the topic is somewhat controversial. There appears to be disagreement among historians as to the motivations of the occupying Italians, who were under the orders of Mussolini's fascist regime and committing atrocities against Slovenians and others while protecting Jews from the Nazis and Croatian fascists. This is an entirely valid debate. The contradictions in the conduct of the Italians are glaring. I am also aware that current historiographical trends attribute the humane Italian attitude towards Jews in occupied Europe primarily to political and strategic considerations, rather than humanitarian ones. While this may be a legitimate view where it is supported by the documentation, I believe that my memoirs make a strong and substantiated case for the humanitarian considerations. In this ongoing debate, I would expect my voice and that of the multitude of others who benefited from the humanity of the Italians to at least be acknowledged, whether it conforms or not to current conventional wisdom. Thank you. The island of Rab, off the Adriatic coast of Croatia. These are the ruins of a concentration camp where the Italian army interned 3,500 Jews in 1943. My father was one of them. Fascist Italy was Nazi Germany's main ally, and Mussolini promised the Germans he would deport these Jews to the town of Trieste, which had a direct railway link to Auschwitz. But the Italian army refused to hand them over. When I visited this island in 1981, it was easy to find the site of the camp. The stone quarry on one of the overlooking hills was clearly visible. According to my father, he and the 3,500 other inmates owed their lives to having been prisoners of fascist Italy. But at the same time, in another Italian camp nearby, hundreds of Slovenians were dying of hunger, disease, and maltreatment. And later on, the fascists collaborated with the Nazis in deporting 8,000 Jews from Italy to the death camps. So who were these Italians who housed and fed Jewish refugees at the height of the Holocaust? Why had they protected Jews, who were not Italian, in foreign territory occupied by their army? I was intrigued by this story, and also a little suspicious. Maybe behind it all there was a tale of corruption and deception that would shed an entirely different light on the whole episode. I decided to try and find out a little more about it.
In occasione della festa dello statuto, le truppe del quinto corpo d'armata sono passate in rassegna dal generale Balocco.
The Italian occupation of parts of Yugoslavia between 1941 and 1943 was at times extremely brutal, and there were cases of horrifying atrocities committed against the local population. I first heard from my father how, during the same period, the Italians saved 4,000 Jews from deportation to Auschwitz, and I later learned that 40,000 others were protected by the Italians in occupied southern France and Greece. This documentary is about that episode. My starting point is my father's story. He escaped from Nazi Vienna in 1938 at the age of 13 and took refuge in the Yugoslav town of Zagreb. But in April 1941, Italy and Germany attacked and occupied Yugoslavia. The country was divided up among the Axis allies, and a pro-German state established in Croatia. My father and his family lived in the capital, Zagreb. The new state was ruled by the Croatian fascists, the Ustaše, whose leader, or poglavnik, was Ante Pavelić. The Ustaše quickly embarked on a campaign of mass murder that was to rival even the one carried out by the Germans. They set up one of their death camps at Jasenovac, on the banks of the river Sava. Inmates were allegedly to take part in this project by building dams.
La nuova Croazia al lavoro. Piano della bonifica lungo la Sava, per la quale sarà scavato un nuovo letto da Jesenice a Pozzute. 50 milioni di cune sono stati stanziati per questi lavori che restituiranno agli agricoltori croati 3.000 iutri di terreno arativo, che la Sava allagava all'epoca delle grandi piogge.
But in the Jasenovac death camp, the Ustaše murdered hundreds of thousands of people, most of them Serbs, but also Gypsies and Jews. My father was arrested and sent there in January 1942, just before his 17th birthday.
I was transferred to Jasenovac with a group of 12, there were 13 of us altogether, from a prison in Zagreb, which was called Savska Cesta. Within 2 days, I was the only one alive of the 13. Jasenovac was really indescribable. And people were being killed every day in various ways, shooting, smashing of skulls, beating to death, hanging, slaughtering. course, many people died in weakness. It was a scene that is very difficult to describe. Of course, I spent only 3 weeks there. I doubt very much I would have survived another week. During those 3 weeks, sometimes I wonder how I did survive, because, for instance, one of the guards that had accompanied our group to the place where we were digging graves apparently decided to kill me. He pushed me into the grave and cocked his gun and shot, supposedly, but no bullet came out. He then turned the gun around and tried to kill me with the butt of his gun. Fortunately, I was lying on these corpses which absorbed the blows. After a while, he got tired of hitting me and told me to get up and continue working harder than before.